Drying the car after washing is one of the final steps in the car care routine, and it works quite well. When a car is sealed, as you can see right now, especially with these modern twisted pulse drying towels, because as you can see here, it works wonderfully on a sealed car. But what happens when the conditions aren't quite ideal? When it's very warm outside, that means we have very little time to dry before it starts to dry on its own. Or it's very cold and very humid, which naturally makes it quite difficult. Or in the worst case, our car is unsealed. And here's what I've done for you. I've removed all the sealants from one half of the hood, and on the right side, it's still sealed. Now let's just give it a try. And see that we still have residual moisture everywhere. We have streaks and we need to go over it multiple times. Oh, over there, even with a damp cloth on the sealed sides, it just works so much better. Thank goodness the car care product industry has a solution for almost every problem. And that's why I want to introduce you to the SONAX PROFILINE Hypercoat today in this video. The SONAX PROFILINE Hypercoat is, as it says here, a wet sealant and drying aid, in English known as a wet sealant. Some also call it wet coat and a drying aid. And that is also the central theme of this video. For me personally, Hypercoat is the best drying aid that exists. And at this point, we unfortunately have to talk about one of the biggest curses of the car care product industry, and a topic that keeps coming up on this channel: terminology. Unfortunately, terms like wet sealants, spray sealants, wax, polymer, ceramic, or whatever else are not used consistently. And every manufacturer can more or less write whatever they want on a bottle. Now back to the topic of this video. A wet sealant is usually a type of sealant that we spray onto the paint while it's still wet after washing, meaning before it dries, and then rinse it off directly with a pressure washer. And then we have a light base form of the sealant applied here. A drying aid is technically a form of wet sealant, but it's not necessarily about having a strong beading effect or an increase in shine or anything like that. It's more about the fact that a drying aid, as the name suggests, makes it easier for us to dry an otherwise unsealed car. And that, in my opinion, is the SONAX PROFILINE Hypercoat. And without beating around the bush, I want to show you right away what the Hypercoat can do, how it works, and how to apply it. This here is a concentrate. If you read the application instructions on the back, it says to wash the car first, then dilute it 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 with a foam sprayer, a pump sprayer, or a spray bottle. Apply it to the paint, rinse it off, dry it, and then you're done. So 1 to 100 to 1 to 200, that's extremely concentrated. From this liter bottle, we can get a total of 100 to 200 liters of drying aid. That's really extreme, and it really puts the rather high price of this bottle into perspective. Now I have a spray bottle prepared here. I have here, as you can see, there are 500 milliliters of fill volume. For 500 milliliters, 1 to 100 means 5 milliliters. First, for 200 means 2.5 milliliters. That means we only need a tiny amount of the product here in a spray bottle. Now it's relatively difficult to just pour such a tiny amount in here, let's say wrist and pie style. It is relatively difficult with such measuring cups because, as you can see, most only start at 10 milliliters. But we don't provide a more precise dosage down here. What works really well here are these draw-up syringes, which allow for finer dosing. This here is relatively large. There are also smaller ones, but you can hold it here and then you can draw it up. And then you have a more relatively accurate dosage, as you can see here. If you don't have a syringe or don't want to use one for any reason, then I would recommend the following. If you're using a measuring cup, you see, yes, this line down here, that's the 10 milliliter mark. Then you pour this in here, and then you just try to stay below that 10 milliliter line. We know that if we stay below the 10 milliliter line, we will end up somewhere, hopefully around 5 or 2.5 somewhere. To be honest, I don't even know if dosing it this precisely really makes that much of a difference. But what you definitely shouldn't do is overdose it, because then there could be problems with spots or streaks again. But you can already see that's the tiny amount of product we need to prepare the Hypercoats. And now let's take a look at this live and together again. I'm doing the hood again, wet. We're still in the same situation. The right side is sealed, the left side is unsealed. I'm now spraying the Hypercoat on this side. And now you can already see what happens. The water film is starting to tear, and that's exactly what a drying aid is supposed to do. I'm going to spray here on the right side as well because I want to try something out here. And then you'll see right away, when I rinse the water off the hood, that the water film no longer stays evenly spread across the hood. Instead, it starts to tear beautifully on the left side. And then we only have, similar to the right side, the sealed side, individual drops to take care of, and that makes the drying process much easier, faster, and more efficient. And it's almost as good as on the side where we have a paint sealant. You can already see we've changed the location for the conclusion. It's just a bit quieter here. For me personally, the SONAX Hypercoat, or generally a good drying aid, is almost a must-have for every car detailer. Especially when you don't have your car sealed. I mean, for us in our bubble, us hardcore car detailers, it's almost unthinkable that we don't apply a sealant after washing. And it doesn't matter whether it's a sealant shampoo, a wet sealant, a quick detailer, a spray wax, a spray sealant, a paste wax, a liquid wax, a polymer sealant, a ceramic sealant, or anything else. But we have to be realistic and say that there are many people who just wash their cars at the self-service box. And they don't want to deal with sealants, claying, polishing, and so on, because yes, it is a bit more time-consuming and it's also a bit more complicated to get into the topic. And for all those who just want to wash their car, I say that a good drying aid like the SONAX Hypercoat is absolutely, as I said, a must-have product to have on hand. Because it makes drying incredibly more pleasant, faster, easier, and more efficient. That's one use case. This means you have a car that is not sealed and you don't want it either. Dealing with sealants. The second use case is when you're a professional detailer and you're preparing a customer's car for subsequent polishing and sealing. So you have to dry the car before you bring it into the hall to polish and seal it. But when you prepare a car for subsequent polishing and sealing, you automatically remove more or less all other forms of sealants that were on the paint, and then drying becomes more difficult again. And you could work with a wet sealant here. But realistically, you have to say that some wet sealants have become so potent that what remains on the paint could negatively affect the polishing. And I have to say again, the SONAX Hypercoat, especially when diluted 1 to 200, makes drying easier for me as a professional detailer. Whether I'm using a drying towel or a paint dryer, and it doesn't affect the subsequent polishing in any way, because what remains on the paint is either so weak or not permanent that it has no negative consequences. So in this case, for the professional detailer, the SONAX Hypercoat is simply fantastic. Good. And at this point, we need to talk again about what we mentioned at the beginning of the video, namely terminology and definitions. I'll say it again, for me, the SONAX Hypercoat, even though it says wet sealant on the front, is primarily a drying aid. You could do it differently. Use the manufacturer's specifications, concentrate it more, which means not 1 to 100 or 1 to 200, but rather 1 to 50 or 1 to 20, maybe. And then it also performs better as a wet sealant. The drops are also more pronounced. Only then does it lose its good qualities, which I have just pointed out to you, that it is only and dedicated. As a drying aid, it works, especially if you're a professional detailer. And I personally have to say, no matter how highly I concentrate and dose it in terms of hydrophobics, it never quite reaches the level of what good, ready-to-use wet sealants can achieve these days. You are capable. And to be fair, you have to say that if you have a sealed car, you don't need a drying aid. Then there's a sealant on your car's paint that already creates hydrophobics. That means only a few droplets remain on the paint anyway, and they can be easily removed with a drying towel. I'll say it again, you don't need a drying aid then. We clearly saw it earlier on the hood. And that's why I said we're going to do a little experiment together. On the sealed side, I also sprayed the Hypercoat on, and there we saw that the hydrophobics were a little worse afterwards than before. And that's because the SONAX Hypercoat has laid over the existing sealant. Now, of course, the question always arises with something like this. How long would this negative effect last? Would it be permanent? And so on. But I have to tell you, I wouldn't take that risk because, again, if you already have a sealed car, I know I'm repeating myself, but that's an important point in this context with the product. Then you don't need a drying aid. And with that, I've said everything I wanted to say about the SONAX Hypercoat. For me personally, it's an absolutely underrated product that doesn't get nearly enough attention for how well it works as a drying aid at the end of the day. If you found the video helpful, informative, exciting, and interesting, feel free to give us a thumbs up, support the channel with a free subscription, and tune in for the next video. Hello!